Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first ever cool down focused on, yes, the fight series. Ladies and gentlemen, today we've got history. History was made by the DDP of the UFC. It's crazy how that rhymes, but yes, we've got the first ever South African. Can I hear all the South Africans get loud and excited about this? Yes, because he is the first ever South African UFC middleweight champion. How he did that, I'm telling you, if I met this man 12 years ago and he told me this was his dream, I probably would have laughed at him and laugh no longer, because he is the champion and he's lifted up that trophy, or should I say that belt, fighting Strickland, who was no slouch. He was an absolute fighter. But this fight in particular, if you don't know anything about the UFC, if you know nothing about fighting and you were tuning in for the first time, both these guys put on a hell of a fight. It was incredible. It had us, obviously, from a South African perspective, on the edge of our seats. But I think generally, if you even just listen to the Canadian audience of the night, I mean, I think they were super jacked, and the outcome was quite a close contest as well. But we're just going to move over. Obviously, like I said, representing South Africa, doing really well, being the first ever champion, and it opens up a whole sort of other questions moving forward with the UFC and possibly moving to African soils for a potential fight. But let's talk about this build up so far. I mean, there was a lot said and done prior to this. We know there was a lot of psychological warfare, as DDP likes to put it, arguably getting the better of Sean Strickland. And when we unpack the fight, maybe this was something that was to the detriment of Sean Strickland. I mean, we know his Vaughan interview that he had where he was crying, Strickland, talking about the issues he had growing up, and Dricus saying he was unapologetic. But leading into the two different press conferences just before the fight, we saw a different Sean Strickland. And I don't know how much of that played a role in this actual fight and the outcome of the fight, because we went from full-on, violent, vintage Sean Strickland ready to rip off Dricus's head to all of a sudden changing his tune, saying, no, he's a great man, he's a great fighter, I'm going to put on a hell of a performance. That they did. Let's not deny that. They put on a hell of a performance. But I wonder how much the sort of pre-battles and the build-up to this actually affected him walking into it. And if we just go and we start unpacking this, I mean, pound for pound, what surprised me was the impression as a South African thinking, geez, Dricus Du Plessis, this big, hard Afrikaans dude coming from South Africa. We know if you're from South Africa, you know what that means. That means the man can pack a punch, he can take a hit, and he can move forward. But what surprised me was weighing these two guys up next to each other. We're looking at their height, which was obviously even. Sean Strickland having a bit of the weight advantage is what caught me off guard a little bit, but the reach was the same. And I think this is when I started asking myself the question into this fight, saying most people saying Sean Strickland probably would have won this fight except for Adesanya. And that is because Strickland has an incredible boxing IQ. I mean, he's got incredible endurance. And the question was, if he could take Dricus the distance in the 5-round fight, if he could take him to that distance, he would probably come out victorious. And this was the question a lot of us were asking as the fight was obviously unfolding. But like I said, just looking at this pound for pound, that's what caught me off guard. And we know that Strickland is a hard guy. I think when we're looking at the fight in particular, this was an interesting stat for me. It's Strickland connected with 41.2% of his total strikes. There was 233 total strikes. Well, Du Plessis made, also, can we just get this right? It's not Dricus, to all the Americans listening. It's not Dricus, it's Dricus. Okay, if you can't pronounce that, there will be a tutorial at the end of the show. However, Du Plessis had 37.6% accuracy out of 197 strikes thrown. And I think this was what was interesting. Towards the end of the fight, when we were looking at it, and a decision had to be made, I was sitting in the camp that I think Strickland had just edged it. And then, winning by a sole point. I mean, you're going to see the scorecard at the bottom here popping up. You got Saldamento gave Strickland the one by 1 point, and then obviously Cleary gave Dricus the point by 1 point, and then Colin coming through with the 1 point thing. That's how close this fight was. And why it was so close was the first two rounds, I think Strickland, did his boxing thing. He went out there, he kept his range, he kept jabbing Dricus. Dricus naturally on the front foot. He said he was going to do that in the press conference. He came through and he stayed on the front foot. And he was trying to ask questions of Strickland. And obviously in that situation, Strickland was reacting every time he tried doing something, and he just kept whacking him in the face with his brilliant boxing prowess. Like I said, man's got an incredible boxing IQ, and he played that to his advantage. It was in the third round where it was touch and go for both of them. And I think it even popped up in during the fight that someone had said that was a level or even sort of fight in terms of the scoring. And what was quite interesting was that Dricus didn't stop moving forward. And I think slowly it was after that round 3, that the crowd all of a sudden, who were Sean Strickland favorites, started chanting DDP. And this is when he started winning him over. And it was that 4th round that he literally gave everything that he had. And I think what's important to note is that Strickland was very calculated. He is a calculated fighter. He's not just going to throw things loose and wild. So he's going to wait for the opportunities. And it was coming off. So if we're looking at this as a boxing match, I think he obviously, based on the statistics I just showed you before that, he was the better boxer. But when we're looking at the UFC fights and we're looking at entertainment and we're looking at who arguably really wanted to win the fight, there's no dispute that that was Dricus. Dricus was throwing things left, right, and center. He, just to unpack more of the stats, when we look at the overall sort of significant strikes, I mean, he went for head, he went for the body, he used his legs. So when we're looking at the overall sort of what is inclusive from a UFC perspective and using all the different sort of potential avenues to take down your opponent, he did more of that than Sean Strickland did. Now, granted, it was in Sean Strickland's sort of wheelhouse to try and stay on his feet and keep Dricus on his feet. And he said that in the press conference as well, try to get into Dricus's mind a little bit, saying, we're going to give the crowd a good fight. We're going to be entertaining. And by doing that, we're going to stay on our feet and throw the punches. Obviously, everyone wants to see a knockout. That's what we want to see. But by saying that, he's kind of baiting Dricus into saying, stay on your feet, go fight my fights, stay boxing pound for pound, and let's see what the outcome can be. But, you know, Dricus, from that perspective, credit to him, he had to change things up. And it was when he started going for the takedowns that he really started landing his punches. Because after that, he was tiring out Strickland, who looked extremely comfortable, might I add, when he was just sparring with him. And then it was the takedowns that was tiring. And that's when all of a sudden Dricus starting to close the distance between the two of them and started landing 1 or 2 punches. And when he started landing the punches, then he started asking some serious questions of Strickland. And that's where I would say the crowd started turning and the scorecard obviously started edging towards Dricus' favor. Now, we went into the last round. At that point, like I said, it was very, very even. But just going back to this again, landed by target. We're looking at 90% head. Look at Sean Strickland's sort of punching prowess here. 90% landed at the head. Landed by position, obviously kept his distance really well, and that's the strength of his boxing IQ. I've already mentioned that. But look at how he attacked the body. He didn't attack the body that much, and he didn't use his legs that much. Whereas when we're comparing the two, the boxer versus more holistic, unpredictable Dricus Du Plessis, look how he approached the head, how he approached the body, and approached the leg. And ultimately, I think that was the difference in terms of what swung the judges' votes. And per round, we're unpacking the per rounds, and I think this is quite an interesting observation. Like I said, Strickland won the first round. Second round, here, according to this, we're looking at the contact. They're saying Dricus arguably nudged that. But I think the difference in all these fights, you got to remember that Dricus wasn't taken seriously. Prior to his Whittaker fight, everyone was slamming him, saying he wasn't a real fighter. He's proved all the doubters wrong, beating Whittaker, and now obviously being crowned champion. But all those fighters prior to that Whittaker fight did not take Dricus seriously. And that played to his advantage. This being the second ever UFC fight in his career to go the full 5 rounds. Everything before that has been closed out. He's knocked his opponents out. And I think that is down to his opponents not taking him seriously and allowing him to swing wildly and connect them. Because when he connects you, you're obviously going to feel it and drop. And I think this is the difference in Strickland. Strickland being hyper aware that if he closes that distance between the two of them, there's the potential to get knocked out. So he played it very smart, in my opinion. He kept his distance, played the punching, the jab. His jab was unbelievable, did some serious damage. And Dricus had to close the distance. And that's where the takedowns became very important for him. That's where sort of, you know, tiring him out through the wild swings. And look, he missed a lot of those. He missed a lot of those punches. But in the end, when we went into that final round, it was anyone could take that. And I think that's when you also saw Sean Strickland's corner get riled up a little bit and start saying, you know, you can't let him take you down. You got to start coming into this because this last round is going to be a swing sort of position as to who wins this fight. And I actually think, personally speaking, despite being South African, I actually think Strickland got the better of him in that last round. But when we're moving forward, and I think even Dana came out saying on his personal score sheet, he actually said Strickland had won it. But I think it was the fact that Dricus, when we're looking at what UFC should stand for anyway, Dricus showed the most desire to win the fight, to knock out the opponent, to take the fight to his opponent. Whereas Strickland, obviously, was somewhat penalized, I'd say, in terms of trying to be the more accurate, more strategic fighter. I think if this was a boxing fight, I think if it was a boxing match, Strickland wins this. Largely because that's how boxing is seen. It's about landing the punches and managing your opponent like this. But from a UFC perspective, I think the grit, the fights, and I think the turning of the crowd, I wonder how much of that actually swayed the judges, as well as, again, him looking strong afterwards, him going around parading, saying he was the champion, versus Strickland, not being in the same sort of ego after the fight. And the interesting thing, let's go back to the psychological parts of it. I wonder, when we're looking at Strickland, him downplaying prior to all of this, saying, it doesn't matter if he's champion, he doesn't fight for the belt, he fights for the people, and whether he wins or loses. And that was the difference, I think, in terms of this build-up. And that's why I was mentioning it before, is because Dricus came out saying he's here to win, and he's going to win. Whereas Strickland said, he doesn't mind. Whatever happens, happens. And I think that was the difference in the end of the fight. If he had backed himself a little bit more and took the fight to Dricus, who knows what could have happened. But in the end, it went 5 rounds. Dricus showed he had the stamina to make it towards the end, which for me was the surprising part, because he looked gassed after the 3 rounds, and all of a sudden, 4th round came, and he absolutely owned it. And then the 5th round, he just had to stay on his feet, and he gave pound for pound what Strickland was giving him. And in the end, that got him towards the end. That got him towards the title. Now we got our first South African champion. And obviously, from an African perspective, the question is, what happens next? And that is when we're looking at the whole Adesanya sort of battle. And we know what was happened. We know that Dricus Du Plessis was lined up to fight him. We know Dana White wasn't happy because DDP pulled out, saying he had injured his foot and he wasn't in the right physical condition to take him on, and throw in Sean Strickland, took the opportunity, became the champion, maybe throwing Adesanya off guard. Adesanya prepping and focusing on DDP as his opponent, and that didn't quite work out. But now the question is this the next fight? Me personally, that fight between DDP and Strickland was so entertaining. I think, Sean Strickland probably earns the right for another rematch. But the other thing is that Sean Strickland has the crowd liking him. So at some point, this fight will take place. And I think Dana White's even come out saying that already in the post-match conference, that this fight will take place. Because like I said, it was hell of entertaining. But the question is, the real African battle now, the debates that were coming up. From a South African perspective, this is probably the one we want to see. And it's the one we want to see on African soil, because Dricus has earned that right to defend his title on African soil. And, bring it home to South Africa and let us get a taste of the UFC. But it didn't take too long for Adesanya to come out and already put this in his Instagram status, saying, "This arc in my story was written long ago. Our paths are destined to cross again. Stay tuned for the next episode. Thanks for watching. We write history." So I don't think it's going to be a secret. I don't think there's anyone else going to be lined up other than Adesanya. And the man has good recognition. He's well known within middleweight for good reason. And I think Dricus wants him. When we're looking at the styles and we're looking at who comes out who comes out as the victor, I think it's going to be super interesting. We know that the style bender's got a hell of a kick on him. He keeps his distance, but Sean Strickland won that fight because he was able to close the distance, similar to what Dricus did to Sean Strickland today. So I think if Dricus does what he does to Sean Strickland today, doesn't give the style bender the space or the time to think about what he's doing, I think Dricus should come out on top and make it 2 for 2 or should I say, win for the first time as a champion. But what is quite interesting about this fight in particular, obviously it took place in Canada, arguably meant to be neutral ground, but we know going into it, Sean Strickland was the Canadians' favorite. But Dricus turns him over during the fight and actually wins them over. But in this UFC 297, it was the highest announced gate in Toronto since the Jones versus the Machado fight. And that was quite an achievement for Dricus and Strickland when we're looking at it. I mean, to date, the gate made $7.6 million, 18,000 seats sold out. Now, in terms of fighting UFC, that's a huge, huge total in terms of capacity. And that brings us to the next question. And that is obviously the UFC in South Africa. And where would that take place if it came to South Africa? In my opinion, there's two places. This first option, obviously in Pretoria, large because this is where Dricus trains. This is where he's got his crowd. We've got the Sunbets Arena in Times Square in Pretoria. Yes, South African Times Square, not to be confused with New York. But the capacity is only 8,500. So is it going to be big enough to be the first ever African sort of UFC fight to take place? I'm not so sure. But the other one on the cards for me personally, whether or not it's going to be great to actually watch the fight because it's going to be seats are quite far. The Sea Point Stadium, 55,000 seats are in Cape Town. I think it's going to make a hell of a sort of journey for all the tourists and the Americans wanting to come see South Africa for the first time. And then again, selling this out for 55,000 people for Dricus fighting Adesanya, I think is possible 100%. Then it's just determined about how they price the tickets and who they're going to sell it to in particular. But that's probably the option in my mind. On a side note, Drake did lose 700,000 on this particular fight as he backed Strickland. He also lost a lot of money on the Strickland Adesanya fight. So he didn't learn his lesson in terms of going for the underdog. Probably should have stuck with that. But right, let me know what your thoughts in the comment. How do you think Dricus did in the fight? Obviously, if you're South African, you're going to be stoked regardless of how he fought. But as a South African, he made the nation proud. I actually got personal chills over all of this. So Dricus, well done. We're looking forward to that next fight. Thanks for flying that flag super, super high. And to all you other people who joined us for the first time, like I said, this is the cool down. It is the fighter series. And thank you. And remember, if you don't know what to be cool.